February 12th, 1962. The Copa room is roaring when a Chicago boss stands up and slices Dean Martin down in front of everyone who matters. Dean can joke, apologize, or keep singing to stay safe. Instead, he steps toward the threat and risks everything. Where are you watching from? And then he does what nobody in Vegas dares. Las Vegas in the early 60s ran on two spotlights, the one on stage and the one you felt on your back when you said the wrong thing. The Sands wasn't just a hotel. It was an agreement everyone pretended not to read: cash, glamour, and a silent understanding about who truly decided careers. Dean Martin understood those rules. He also benefited from them. His smile was a shield, his loosened tie a signal that nothing could touch him. That night, the Copa room was packed tight with celebrities, reporters, casino men, and tourists who saved for months just to hear him glide through That's Amore. Frank Sinatra watched from a side table, relaxed but alert, like a friend who knew the price of a wrong moment. Then the room shifted. Chairs scraped. Conversations died mid-word. An entourage moved like a single animal toward the front. Men in suits that didn't need to look expensive to look dangerous. Sam Giancana took a table that wasn't his, and no one argued. Not even the people who were forced to stand and pretend it was fine. Dean's voice stayed smooth, but his eyes flicked once, twice, calculating. The applause after the final note landed softer, as if the room feared making too much noise tonight. Sam didn't need to shout to be heard, but he did anyway, because humiliation works better when it's public. He rose with a slow confidence, letting the room feel the pause, then cut through the applause with a single line. That was terrible. Dean's smile stayed in place, but it turned into a mask you could almost see hanging from his cheeks. This wasn't a heckler in the back. This was the kind of man managers greeted with shaking hands, the kind of man a maitre d' obeyed without asking names. A few people laughed out of reflex, then stopped when no one else joined them. Around the room, executives stopped pretending to sip their drinks. A journalist lowered his pen, waiting for the next word like it could be evidence. Frank's posture tightened. He half stood, then froze when Sam flicked a finger in his direction as if moving a piece on a board. The danger wasn't a fistfight. It was the invisible contract. If you embarrass power, power collects. Dean could play along, laugh at himself, sing the next song, and let the moment disappear. That was the Vegas survival trick. Turn insult into entertainment. Swallow pride. Live to headline tomorrow. But Sam wanted more than a joke. He wanted Dean smaller, owned, reminded in front of 2,800 witnesses. Dean had practiced calm the way other men practice scales. Years in clubs taught him that a room can turn on you fast, and the trick is to never look surprised. So he stood under the spotlight and let Sam talk, listening not just to the words, but to the message behind them. You don't belong to yourself. He could feel the band waiting. Horns held mid-breath, the drummer's sticks hovering like punctuation that refused to land. In the front row, a couple stared at their tablecloth as if eye contact could get them in trouble. Dean's mind ran through consequences in clean, brutal steps. Walk off and you're difficult. Clap back and you're reckless. Apologize and you're safe, until the next time. And he knew there would be a next time, because once a man humiliates you and you accept it, the lesson spreads. Every performer in that room had made tiny compromises to keep working, changed a joke, skipped a comment, laughed when they didn't want to. Dean had done it too. He told himself it was professionalism, that it protected the band, the staff, his family. But hearing himself reduced to an object, he felt a new fear rise, one that didn't come from Sam. The fear of becoming the kind of man who can't recognize his own face anymore. Long before Vegas crowns and tuxedos, Dean was Dino Crocetti, a barber's son who learned early that charm was a kind of currency. He'd watched men with hard hands and tired eyes trade dignity for a paycheck, then come home and pretend it didn't hurt. Music became his escape, but it also became his lesson. The room listens when you sound sure of yourself. By the time the Rat Pack made him a symbol of cool, Dean had already built a private rule. Never let anyone see you sweat. He drank to loosen the edges, joked to blur the sharp parts, and smiled through pressure because smiling kept doors open. But there was another rule he didn't talk about, the one that sat underneath all the others. If you let a bully define you once, you spend your whole life negotiating with that moment. Standing on that stage, Dean remembered every small surrender he'd made in this town, every handshake that lasted a second too long, every phone call answered too politely. He thought of younger singers watching from the back, learning what was acceptable, and he realized the real choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between being controlled forever or taking one clear stand and living with whatever came next. His face stayed calm. Inside, something hardened into decision. Dean shifted his weight and let the silence stretch. A performer's pause turned into a test of wills. He looked past Sam to the faces behind him. Agents calculating headlines, singers measuring their courage, waiters frozen between tables. The room had decided this was no longer entertainment. It was instruction. Dean thought of how power worked here. Never loud, always certain, enforced by the knowledge that consequences didn't need to be explained. He felt the microphone cool in his hand and realized how rare it was to hold something that gave you a voice when everyone else wanted you quiet. The easy laugh would have landed safely. The apology would have ended it. Instead, you walked to the edge of the stage, close enough that Sam could see his eyes clearly. The spotlight followed, trapping them together. Dean spoke evenly, the way he did when he wanted a joke to land, except this time there was no punchline waiting to save him. He named the difference between earning applause and demanding fear. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult Sam's suit or his men. He aimed higher, at the idea that intimidation could replace talent. Around them, the band stayed still, sensing that music would cheapen what was happening. Dean's calm made the moment heavier. It told the room this wasn't a tantrum. It was a line being drawn. Sam listened with a smile that never reached his eyes, the kind that told you he enjoyed watching people talk themselves into trouble. His men shifted, testing the air, waiting for a signal. Dean kept going, careful with each sentence, knowing that clarity was his shield. He spoke about work, about earning a stage inch by inch, about audiences who paid to feel something real. Then he said the thing no one said out loud. That fear was a shortcut, and shortcuts rot whatever they build. A murmur rippled through the crowd, quickly swallowed by the weight of the room. At a side table, Frank Sinatra stood halfway, palms open as if he could physically hold the moment still. Sam finally answered, his voice low, promising consequences without listing them. The threat wasn't the words, it was the certainty behind them. Dean nodded once, acknowledging reality without submitting to it. Maybe, he said, accepting the cost as if he'd already paid it. That acceptance changed everything. People who thrive on fear need their target to bargain. Dean didn't. He turned to the audience and spoke to them directly, apologizing not for himself, but for the interruption, refusing to perform where respect was treated like property. When he set the microphone down, the small thud sounded final, like a door closing. The walk-off stage felt longer than any encore. Backstage, the noise vanished, replaced by the hum of cables and the quick, frightened whispers of people who knew how stories ended in this town. Frank caught up to him, anger and concern colliding in his voice. "Do you know what you just did?" Dean did. His hand shook now that the spotlight was gone, the delayed cost of adrenaline. He said it plainly, that he'd chosen dignity over comfort, and that the choice might take everything. Frank argued for survival, for patience, for living to sing another night. Dean listened, because friendship deserves that much. But he didn't retreat. The fear he felt was clean, not the old familiar dread that asked him to shrink. Word spread through the building in minutes. Phones rang. Managers whispered. A contract was under review. Doors that had always been open quietly closed. Outside, a small knot of fans waited, sensing history without knowing which side it would land on. Inside a private room, Sam Giancana raged without theatrics, issuing orders with clipped precision. The blacklist began immediately. In Vegas, that usually meant the end. Dean knew it. So did everyone else. The surprise came from beyond the desert. By morning, the story wasn't framed as a tantrum or an insult. It was framed as a refusal. Newspapers led with the confrontation, radio hosts debated it, and callers lined up to say they were tired of fear running the show. Within days, Dean's phone rang with an unexpected tone, Official, careful, federal. The message was simple. What happened mattered. His stand had given shape to a feeling people already had but hadn't seen reflected by someone famous enough to risk everything. Dean didn't become a crusader overnight. He stayed measured, refusing to gossip, speaking instead about work and respect and the quiet pressure everyone pretended was normal. Other performers began to talk too, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as they realized they weren't alone. The reaction unsettled the old balance. Investigators paid attention. Contracts were scrutinized. The idea that entertainers were disposable started to crack. Dean watched it from a distance, still banned from rooms that once begged him to headline, still unsure how far the backlash would go. He felt loss, yes, but also relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't negotiating with fear. He had already met it on stage and walked past it. Pressure returned in subtler ways. Friends warned him to lie low, to stop answering calls, to let the storm pass. A few offers vanished without explanation. A few invitations arrived and were quietly withdrawn. Dean understood the language. Uncertainty was the new weapon. If fear couldn't silence him outright, it would exhaust him. He kept his days structured, rehearsals, meetings, long walks that let his thoughts settle. He refused to complain in public. That restraint mattered. It kept the story clean. Reporters tried to bait him into naming names. He declined, speaking instead about systems, about how power hides in habits everyone accepts. The restraint frustrated his critics and strengthened his supporters. Letters arrived from singers he'd never met, thanking him for saying the thing they'd practiced saying alone in mirrors. The fear didn't disappear, it sharpened. But it no longer decided his schedule. Dean noticed something else too. The audience had changed. People didn't ask about songs first. They asked how it felt to stand there and not bend. That question carried responsibility. He wasn't interested in being a symbol, but symbols choose you sometimes. And once chosen, you either collapse under them or learn to stand still. Dean chose stillness, trusting that time would do the loud work for him. The night replayed endlessly on television, slowed down, analyzed frame by frame. Commentators debated whether Dean had been brave or foolish, whether principle could survive a town built on leverage. Clips froze on his face as he stepped forward, the exact moment where a safe joke would have saved him. Viewers saw the calm and mistook it for confidence. Few understood it was resolve mixed with fear, held in balance. Behind the scenes, lawyers talked about protections that didn't yet exist, and unions felt public pressure harden into purpose. Dean was invited to rooms with men who spoke carefully, weighing every sentence. He didn't promise crusades. He promised honesty. That steadiness made him credible. When asked if he'd perform in Vegas again, he answered without bitterness. Not under conditions that treated him like property. The answer traveled. It changed how negotiations started. The event night became a reference point, a before and after whispered during contract talks. Even those who disagreed with him adjusted their language. They sensed the crowd had shifted. Power hates unpredictability. Dean had introduced it with a single refusal, and now the old assurances no longer sounded certain. Publicly, he stayed composed. Privately, the cost arrived late at night. There were moments when the phone didn't ring, when he imagined paths not taken, apologies that would have kept the lights on. He talked it through with people he trusted, admitting doubt without surrendering the choice. Doubt, he learned, wasn't weakness. It was proof the decision mattered. He began performing elsewhere, smaller rooms at first, audiences leaning forward to listen for something beyond the songs. He gave them the music, but he also gave them presence. Silence between notes felt heavier now, like it carried meaning. After shows, strangers shook his hand longer than usual. Some said nothing at all, eyes bright with gratitude they couldn't articulate. Dean took those moments seriously. They reminded him that respect isn't granted by contracts. It's recognized by people who see themselves in your risk. The work regained its center. He sang because he wanted to, not because he was expected to smooth over someone else's temper. That difference changed the sound. Critics noticed. They wrote about depth, about a voice that carried lived-in truth. The blacklist hadn't ended his career. It had clarified it. Months later, the ripple reached authority. Meetings turned formal. Questions became precise. Dean spoke carefully, offering patterns rather than accusations, describing climates instead of names. He understood lines you don't cross, even when crossing lines is the story everyone wants. What mattered was movement. Oversight increased. Clauses appeared in contracts where none had existed. Security protocols were written down, not whispered. None of it erased the past, but it changed the future's posture. Dean watched the process with guarded hope, resisting the urge to declare victory. Real change, he knew, rarely announces itself. It shows up as fewer frightened phone calls, as young performers negotiating without lowering their voices. When asked if he'd do it again, he didn't pretend the answer was easy. "I don't recommend fear," he said once, choosing his words. "But I recommend deciding who you are before someone else does." The line traveled because it felt earned. It didn't ask for applause. It asked for reflection. And reflection, in a town built on distraction, was revolutionary. The power flipped not with noise, but with posture. When Dean spoke about that night, he never raised his chin or tightened his jaw. He described it as a decision made in real time, under lights that made everything honest. That honesty stripped the glamour from intimidation. Suddenly, the old threats sounded small when repeated aloud. Executives began to realize that public sympathy had teeth. Sponsors asked uncomfortable questions. Rooms that once relied on fear started relying on lawyers. Dean's refusal became a template, calm, specific, unprovoked by insult. It was harder to smear a man who wouldn't exaggerate his own courage. At a televised interview, he paused before answering a loaded question and said simply, "I didn't win anything that night. I chose something." The distinction mattered. It reframed courage as a personal boundary, not a performance. Viewers felt invited, not lectured. That invitation was dangerous to the old order. It suggested that dignity was portable, that you could take it with you if you were willing to leave a room that denied it. The genius wasn't defiance, it was restraint. By refusing to personalize the conflict, Dean denied his antagonist the spectacle he wanted. Power thrives on spectacle. Deprived of it, it weakens. The confrontation's afterimage lingered in quieter exchanges. Backstage, in hallways, on phone calls that started with long silences, people tested the new reality. "What if we said no?" they asked, half joking. Dean didn't coach anyone. He answered questions when asked and stayed out of arguments he didn't need to win. That restraint made his earlier stand feel bigger, not smaller. It wasn't about ego. It was about setting a floor beneath which he would not step. When asked to return under conditions that hadn't changed, he declined without drama. The absence of bitterness unsettled those used to leverage. There was nothing to push against. Contracts evolved quietly. Clauses appeared that protected performances from interruption. Grievance procedures gained teeth. None of it made headlines, but all of it changed daily life. The crowd's memory did the rest. Audiences listened differently, attuned to moments when a performer chose honesty over safety. Dean's songs took on a new resonance, not because he sang them differently, but because people heard them differently. They knew the man behind the smile had decided where he stood. That knowledge carried weight. No mob could counterfeit. The antagonist's response arrived without apology. He withdrew, tightened circles, refused proximity. Influence doesn't evaporate, it relocates. But it was constrained now by attention it couldn't control. Attempts to isolate Dean faltered when public interest turned isolation into proof. Fear needs privacy. Dean had dragged it into light. In interviews, he refused to celebrate the other man's discomfort. He spoke instead about the cost of silence, how it compounds over time until you forget it's a choice. The line landed because it named a truth people recognized. Backstage, younger performers thanked him with awkward sincerity. Older ones nodded, regret and relief crossing their faces in the same breath. Dean accepted both. He knew courage doesn't erase consequences. It rearranges them. He still lost rooms. He still paid for nights he didn't play. But he also gained something sturdier, a reputation for boundaries. When pressure came, it came openly now, framed as negotiation rather than threat. That change alone altered math. Genius reactions don't shout. They change the terms so shouting becomes unnecessary. Authority noticed the shift. Public sentiment had moved, and institutions follow sentiment once it hardens. Conversations that once felt symbolic turned procedural. Oversight increased. Protections were codified. Dean participated carefully, understanding the difference between testimony and vendetta. When he spoke with Robert Kennedy, the emphasis was on climate, not names, how intimidation functioned, how silence was maintained, how fear became routine. The goal wasn't revenge. It was prevention. The response was measured but real. New scrutiny, clearer rules, fewer shadows to hide in. The crowd felt it first. Shows ran without interruption. Contracts carried recourse. Security protocols existed on paper, not rumor. None of it was perfect, but perfection had never been the point. Dean watched the tension ease and felt a quiet satisfaction that didn't need validation. He hadn't toppled the system alone. He'd introduced friction into a machine that depended on smooth compliance. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes one refusal is the lever that lets many others move. Tension broke the way ice does, without drama, just a soft release you notice after the fact. Crowds returned to enjoying shows without scanning the room for permission. Managers spoke more plainly. The absence of interruption became the story. Dean felt it during performances elsewhere, where silence between notes was no longer anxious, but attentive. He sensed the room leaning in because it trusted him. Trust is rare currency. Once earned, it circulates quietly. People who once warned him to be careful now asked how he stayed calm. He answered with a shrug and the truth. Calm comes from deciding early. The nights were still long, and the doubts still arrived unannounced, but they no longer dictated his choices. When fear showed up, it found no leverage. That frustrated the old playbook. Without panic, threats lost shape. The audience's reaction mattered most. They applauded longer, not louder, an acknowledgement rather than a cheer. Dean understood that applause wasn't for the stand itself, but for the consistency that followed. Courage that doesn't settle into character is just a moment. His had settled. Privately, Dean replayed the night in smaller pieces, the scrape of chairs, the cut of a sentence, the weight of the microphone before he set it down. He talked about it once with a young comic at a party who asked whether it was worth it. Dean took his time. He said the cost was real and ongoing, that bravery doesn't end consequences. Then he added the part people rarely hear, the relief. Relief is quiet. It doesn't pose for photos. It shows up when you sleep without rehearsing apologies you won't make. He admitted regret too, not for the stand, but for the years he'd spent practicing silence. The admission surprised him with its honesty. He realized that the past can't be fixed, only contextualized. You learn, then you live differently. That lesson felt generous. It meant mistakes weren't chains, they were instructions. Dean carried that into his work, choosing projects that aligned with how he wanted to feel at the end of a night. The audience sensed the alignment. They didn't need the backstory to recognize integrity when they saw it. The industry adjusted. Younger performers negotiated with more confidence. Unions pressed for protections without whispering. The mythology around intimidation thinned as procedures replaced rumor. Dean stayed mostly out of it, content to let systems do what systems do once nudged into motion. He understood that permanence requires boredom, forms, meetings, rules that feel unglamorous but hold. When asked about the antagonist, he declined to relitigate. He knew attention feeds the wrong fires. What mattered was the change you could measure. Fewer interruptions, clearer contracts, a sense that respect wasn't optional. Dean's life settled into a rhythm that felt earned. He performed, he laughed, he chose his rooms. The story followed him anyway, growing legs of its own. People told it to explain why they said no in meetings, why they walked away from bad deals. That's how influence really works, not as command, but as permission. Dean had given permission. Years later, the night was remembered as a hinge. Not because one man spoke back, but because he walked away. Walking away is underrated. It confuses power that expects negotiation. Dean's quote surfaced often, sometimes misattributed, sometimes paraphrased, but always pointing to the same truth. Freedom begins when fear loses its audience. Obituaries would list the songs, the movies, the friendships. Those mattered, but among performers, his legacy lived elsewhere, in the knowledge that dignity can be a decision you make once and honor daily. The modern industry, more regulated and less beholden to shadows, didn't happen because of a single voice. It happened because that voice made others audible. On that February night, a man tried to make Dean Martin small. Instead, Dean chose his size. He chose it publicly, calmly, and without spectacle. That choice outlived the room, the threat, and the moment. It taught a simple lesson that endures. Talent shines, but integrity steadies the light. Courage doesn't shout, it chooses. If this story moved you, tap like, subscribe for more human stories of dignity under pressure, and tell us in the comments. When have you walked away to keep your self-respect? Your answer might help someone else choose wisely today.